My grandmother kept a kitchen garden on the east side of the house so the morning light would hit the tomatoes first. She planted it the same way every year, tomatoes along the fence rail, pole beans behind them, a row of marigolds on the outside edge because she said the deer didn't like the smell. She grew up in that house. Her mother grew up in it before her. The house itself was built in 1931 by her grandfather, Olin Stiles, who cut the timber for it off the same ridge that backs up against the property line, who hauled the stones for the foundation out of the creek with a team of mules, and who is buried about 40 yards into the woods behind the smokehouse in a grave that is now mostly hidden by a stand of tulip poplars that have seeded in around it over the decades. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. The house sits on a piece of ground in Yancey County, North Carolina, up a gravel road that branches off NC 197 somewhere between the town of Burnsville and the smaller community of Kello. I'm not going to get more specific than that. And my grandmother's family asked me not to use their real names. I'm going to call my grandmother Nell, which is not her name, but is close enough to feel honest to me. Her husband I'll call Roy. Their land runs maybe 60 acres total, most of it steep and wooded, with a flat bottom section along a small tributary of the South Toe River where the garden is, where the house is, where the old cattle barn still stands, even though Roy stopped keeping cattle in it about 12 years ago, when his knees started making that kind of work unreasonable. The South Toe River drains off the Black Mountains, which are the range that contains Mount Mitchell. Mount Mitchell is the highest peak east of the Mississippi River, 6,784 feet, if you want the number. The country around it is real mountain country, not the worn-down hill country you get in parts of the Appalachians further north. These are steep, wet, dense, heavily forested slopes, cove forests in the lower drainages with yellow birch and tulip poplar and basswood and black cohosh, carpeting the floor in shade so deep you feel it as a temperature change when you step in from a sunny slope. Spruce fir forests on the upper ridges above around 5,500 feet. The kind of woods that smell like something colder and older than most of the forests in the eastern United States. Rhododendron and mountain laurel in the middle elevations, so thick in places that you cannot push through them. You go around or you go over. I want to say something about Nell before I tell you what she told me, because the kind of person she is matters for the kind of story this is. She is not dramatic. She doesn't exaggerate. She doesn't have any patience for nonsense, which is a word she uses fairly broadly. She spent 40 years as a practical nurse working out of a clinic in Burnsville, driving those mountain roads in every season, going home to a farm where the work doesn't stop. And she has the kind of temperament that comes from that life. Flat, observant, not given to embellishment. When she tells you something, she tells you because she has thought about it carefully and decided it is worth saying. She does not tell you things she is not sure of, and she does not dress things up. She is also someone who has spent her whole life on the edge of that mountain, and she understands those woods the way people understand ground. They have walked their whole lives. She knows the sound of a bear working through the laurel thicket. She knows the different sounds of deer moving at speed versus deer feeding and browsing. She can tell you what the creek sounds like in spring flood versus what it sounds like in August when the water is low, and she can tell you both without having to think about it. She is not a person who gets spooked by wildlife, and she is not a person who fills in what she doesn't know with what she imagines. She sat down with me at her kitchen table in the second week of October 2 years ago. Roy was in the back room watching the news. She made coffee and she put a plate of sausage biscuits on the table and she said, "I need to tell you what happened last summer, because I'm not going to be able to keep it to myself forever. And you're the one in this family who pays attention to things like this. That's how it started." She said it happened over 3 nights in late July, which would have been the summer before our conversation. Roy had been in poor health through the spring, a knee replacement that hadn't healed correctly, an infection that put him back in the hospital for 10 days, a slow recovery that required him to stay off the stairs. He was sleeping in the downstairs bedroom, the one that had been the guest room for most of their married life. Nell was sleeping upstairs, in the room that had been their room for 30-some years. The window on the east side of that room looks out over the kitchen garden, and beyond the garden fence, the tree line where the ground begins to climb. It is a double-hung window with wooden sash, old glass, the kind of window that shows the world slightly wavered when you look through it at certain angles. Nell had started leaving it open at night because the summer had been hot, and the upstairs room didn't have a window unit. She said she'd been sleeping with it open for most of July without incident. She woke up on the first night because of the smell. I asked her to describe it, and she took a minute with it, the way she took a minute with things she wanted to say correctly. She said it was animal, clearly animal, but not any specific animal she could place a name to. She knew skunk well. You can't live 40 years on that property and not know skunk. She knew the smell of a bear from 2 close encounters she'd had on the property over the decades. She knew the smell of cattle and pigs and the particular deep musk of a rutting deer in October. She said this was different from all of those and also somehow larger than all of them, heavier, muskier. There was something underneath it that was almost sweet, the way a piece of fruit just at the edge of rotting is still sweet before it tips over into purely rotten, and it sat in the back of her throat in a way that the smell of most animals doesn't do. She said she lay there in the dark, smelling it and trying to identify it, and she couldn't. She described it as old. That was the word she settled on after trying several others, old, like something that had been alive in the same body for a very long time, carrying the accumulated smell of that length of time. She lay there listening, and at first she didn't hear anything. Then she heard the garden. What she means by that is the sound of something moving through the garden bed. The marigolds on the outside of the fence are tall by late July, and the tomato plants are staked and caged and filling out, and the pole beans are up on their strings on the fence rail, and there is a narrow corridor of soft, bare soil between the fence rail and the wall of the house. Something moving through that corridor makes a particular sound, a soft brushing against the fence wood, a small shift of leaf against leaf. She had heard the sound before, when a groundhog was working under the fence after the beans. She knew what a small animal moving through that space sounded like. This was not that sound. This was the sound of something large moving slowly and with care. Carefully, she said, like it was trying not to make more noise than it had to. She didn't get up. She said later she couldn't entirely explain why. Partly she didn't want to wake Roy, who needed the sleep and would have had trouble getting up to deal with whatever it was on his bad knee. Partly something older and quieter than her practical nurse brain said, wait. She lay on her back, with her eyes open in the dark, and she listened to whatever was moving through her garden below her. And after a while the sound stopped, and after a while the smell faded, and she stayed there a while longer, and then she went back to sleep. She didn't say anything to Roy the next morning. She went out to the garden and walked the fence line and looked. The outside of the garden fence had a strip of ground between it and the slope that was covered in the pressed-down stems and leaves of the marigold row, which was planted outside the fence itself as a deer deterrent. The marigolds had been pressed down along a section maybe 10 feet wide, not broken, pressed, as if something heavy had leaned against the fence from the outside over that stretch. 2 of the tomato cages inside the fence were leaning slightly. She straightened them. She told herself deer. She told herself a bear that had come to the fence and smelled the tomatoes and decided not to bother with the fence. Both of those things happened on that property. Both of those explanations fit, more or less, if you didn't think too hard about the smell or the sound.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby, so if you want to check it out, link's down below, and let's get you back to the video.
The second night, it came to the window. She woke up at what she thinks was around 2 in the morning, maybe 2:30. She said she woke the way you wake when the quality of the night has changed. Not a specific sound, not a loud thing, but a shift in what the night was doing. The tree frogs had been going steadily. They always are in July on that property. Gray tree frogs and Cope's gray tree frogs and spring peepers still singing late from the wet places along the creek. She had been hearing them all night in her sleep, and then at some point she stopped hearing them, and the absence of them was what pulled her out of sleep. She opened her eyes. The window was in front of her, curtain moving in the breeze, and in the gap at the bottom she could see the top rail of the garden fence and above it the darker dark of the tree line. The clouds had been going in and out all night, and the moon was behind them, and everything was in that ambient night light that a clear night at elevation gives you. Not darkness, not enough to read by, but enough to see shapes. Something was standing at the fence. She could see the shape of it from where she lay. It was on the outside of the fence, the uphill side, and it was tall enough that she could see it clearly through the window from the second floor of the house, which puts its head at well above the fence rail. The garden fence runs about 5 feet high, and the ground on the uphill side of the fence drops a foot or so from the garden grade, so you'd add that foot back, call it 6 feet clear. Whatever was at the fence had its head above the top of the window frame. From her perspective, which she said put it at. She stopped and thought about this carefully. It put the head at somewhere around 8 feet off the ground, maybe a little more. She said she was judging from an angle and she didn't want to overclaim, but 8 feet was her best, honest estimate. The thing was standing still. Both hands were on the top rail of the fence. She could see the arms extending down from the level of the fence rail to a body that was upright and broad. The shoulders were wide, she said. She thought about it and then said wide the way working men are wide when they've spent their whole life in physical labor, but wider than that. An unusual width. The kind of width that looked wrong if you tried to put a normal human body under it. She lay still, and she watched it, and it didn't move. It just stood at the fence with its hands on the rail and faced the house. She watched it for what she thinks was close to 10 minutes, though she said time does strange things in a situation like that, and she wouldn't swear to the estimate. The moon shifted behind its cloud, and for a period everything went darker, and she could barely make out the shape at all. Then the moon came back out, and she could see it clearly again. She could see the hair, dark, long, hanging in matted sections, the way hair looks after it's been wet and dried repeatedly without being combed or cut. She said it was clearly hair, not fur. She distinguished between them without prompting, without me asking her to, because she had thought about this herself. She said the difference was in the texture of it in the moonlight, the way it hung, the way it moved slightly in the night breeze. Not the dense uniform pile of an animal coat. Hair. Long, uncared-for hair that had grown for a very long time. She could see the shape of the head and the face, though the face was in shadow even with the moon out, and she couldn't see features clearly. She could see the hands on the fence rail, and she told me, and here she paused for a moment before going on, that the hands were what made her breath go short. She said they were too much like hands, not paws, not the broad soft feet of a bear or the delicate hooves of a deer. Hands with fingers, long dark fingers arranged on the top rail the way a person's hand looks when they've reached up to rest on a fence. Then it turned its head toward the house. She didn't move. She says she stopped breathing. The thing turned its head and seemed to look at the front of the house, scanning. She couldn't tell what it was looking at specifically because she couldn't see its eyes clearly from where she lay. But it was looking in the deliberate way a person looks when they are trying to find something. Then it seemed to settle on the east side of the house, the second floor, the window. She held still. After a long moment, it stepped back from the fence, slowly, carefully, quiet. She said she didn't hear it step back. She heard nothing. It was there, and then it was slightly further away, and the motion between those two states made no sound at all, which she said was one of the things that stayed with her, because something that size moving on that ground should make some sound. It went back toward the tree line, and it went into the trees. The tree frogs started up again, within about 30 seconds of it disappearing into the trees. She noted that detail, and she didn't know what to make of it, but she noted it. She got up. She went downstairs and checked on Roy, who was sleeping. She stood in the kitchen for a while in the dark, not turning on any lights. She stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden and the fence and the tree line, and she thought about what she had seen, and she thought about what she was going to do with it. She did not feel panicked. She felt the way she described feeling sometimes after a hard shift at the clinic, alert and a little hollowed out, processing something that needed processing. She made herself a cup of tea, and she sat at the kitchen table until the sky started to lighten, and then she made the regular coffee and waited for Roy to wake up. She told Roy something that morning. She said she had seen something large at the garden fence in the night, some kind of animal she couldn't identify, and she wanted him to be aware of it. She described it as large and upright. She left out the hands. She left out the hair. She left out most of it. She said she wasn't ready to say those parts out loud yet, even to Roy. She said she was still checking her own account, the way a nurse checks her notes before she signs off on a chart. Roy listened and said he'd keep an eye out and asked if she wanted him to call anyone. She said no. She didn't know what she would ask anyone to do, and she didn't want anyone coming up to the property with ideas about what they were going to find. In the second morning she walked the fence again. Same pressed-down marigolds, same 10-foot section, nothing on the inside of the fence that she could find. She stood at the fence for a while, looking at where the hands had been on the top rail. She couldn't see any clear marks. The wood was old and gray and weathered, and any impression would be subtle. But she thought she could see, in two places, slight compressions in the wood grain, where something had gripped the rail. She told herself she might be imagining those. The third night is the one she told me she needed to tell someone. She had not been sleeping well, which is understandable. She had the window open again because the heat hadn't broken. She was lying awake a little after midnight, not sleeping, listening to the tree frogs, when she smelled it again. Not faintly, not drifting, close and strong, filling the room the way a smell fills a room when its source is right there. She moved her head on the pillow and looked at the window. Something was in the window. The window was filled. Whatever had come up to the wall of the house climbed it, reached it. She couldn't know how, was filling the window frame. She could see the curve of a shoulder on one side, and the line of an arm and the side of a face, and the face was turned toward her. I want to slow down here and try to tell you what she described to me, the way she described it, because she took real care with the words, and I don't want to lose that. She said the window frame was full, not covered, full, like the frame had been sized for it. The shoulder she could see filled the right side of the frame from top to bottom. The arm came down along the right edge, and there was a face, partial, the left side of a face, visible in the upper portion of the frame, turned toward the interior of the room, and the figure was holding something. She saw that in the same moment she understood what she was looking at. It had something cradled against its chest. Against the chest she could partially see through the lower half of the window. Something small, something held against the dark hair of its body, the way a person holds an infant when the infant is very new and needs to be kept warm and close. She sat up in bed. She said she did it before she consciously decided to. Sat straight up, which put her face at maybe 8 or 10 feet from the window, close enough that she was looking nearly directly at whatever was looking in. And she said the thing did not startle, did not flinch, did not pull back. It looked at her the way, she took some time finding the phrase, The way you look at someone when you have been waiting for them to be awake. That is exactly what she said. Patient, expectant, not threatening, waiting for her to see it. Then it shifted what it was holding, and it lifted it. It held the small thing up so Nell could see it clearly, moved it from where it had been held against its body and raised it toward the window. And the moonlight was enough that Nell could see it. It was a baby. She was clear about this without hesitation. Not a human baby. She said so before I could say anything, anticipating the question. Not human, but shaped on the same plan as a human infant in a way that went beyond coincidence, or beyond what you'd say of any animal young. It was small and dark-furred, and its face was visible in the window light. She said it had a brow ridge. She said it the way a nurse says it, as an anatomical observation, a brow ridge and a flat, wide nose and dark eyes that were open. It was looking. She said that with some emphasis. It was looking around the way a newborn looks, not focused, not directed, but awake and taking in light and shape, doing the thing that newborns do in their first days. She could tell from looking at it that it was very new. She had 40 years of experience with newborns, and she could read the signs of it without having to think. The wrinkled looseness of the skin around the face, the slight bluish quality of the extremities, the way it was tucked in close to itself. Days old, she said, perhaps a week, not older. The mother held the baby up and looked at Nell and waited. Nell sat in her bed and looked at the baby through the window, and she said something happened in her that she had felt before in her nursing career, when the work was good and she was doing it well. She said a kind of calm came in, the kind of calm that isn't the absence of feeling, but is the focus that comes when you know what you're supposed to do. She leaned forward. She leaned until she was close to the window, and she looked at the baby, carefully, the way she had looked at thousands of newborns. She looked at the face, at the hands. She could see the hands, tiny and dark, fingers curled, and she looked at the mother's face, which she could now see more clearly than she had on the second night, because the moon was well out and the distance was much shorter. She described the mother's face carefully, and I listened carefully, and I'm going to tell you what she said. The face was not human in the way a person's face is human. The proportions were different, the brow heavier, the jaw wider, the nose broader and flatter, set back from the front of the face differently than ours are. The eyes were set wider apart than human eyes. The mouth was wide, but the expression on that face, and she said expression deliberately. She said I could see expression. I've been reading faces for 40 years, and what I saw was an expression. The expression was one she had seen before. She said she had seen it in the faces of young mothers who had come a long distance and gone through hard things, and were not sure whether the people around them were going to be kind. A particular kind of watchful need. Not helplessness, not fear. Exactly. But the face of something that has something precious and new and vulnerable and is asking, without words, whether it is safe here. Nell said she nodded. She said she made a deliberate nod at the mother, slow and clear, the kind of nod you make when you want to say without words, yes, I see it. I see what you have. I understand what you're showing me. It is fine. The mother held that look for another moment. Then she lowered the infant back to her body, cradled it, and she turned. She moved away from the window, and she walked back toward the tree line, and she went into the trees. And within about 30 seconds, the tree frogs were going again. Nell said she sat at the window for a long time. She said she felt something she had trouble naming. Not fear, not at that point, not anymore. Something more like being let in on something, like being trusted with something that you weren't sure you'd done anything to deserve. She went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a while in the dark, not making coffee, not doing anything. She stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden, and eventually she went back upstairs and lay down. She found the bundle the next morning. She went out early, before Roy was awake, to check the garden fence. Same pressed marigolds, same section of fence. She walked around the perimeter, and then she went to stand below the east-facing window, on the narrow strip of bare dirt between the foundation stone and the inside edge of the garden fence, and she found 3 impressions in the ground that she hadn't found on the previous mornings. Because on the previous mornings, the thing had not come directly to the wall. She described the impressions carefully to me, using precise language, because she had looked at them carefully, and she wanted me to have it right. They were foot-shaped, broadly speaking, heel, arch, and toe section visible. But the proportions were off from a human foot in specific ways. The great toe was larger and more widely set than it is in a human foot, angled slightly out from the others in a way that suggested, she said, more independent mobility. The ball of the foot was very broad. The overall shape was not a distorted human footprint. It was its own shape, related to a human footprint, but clearly not one. And the impressions were deep. She judged the depth at around 1.5 inches in ground that was moderately soft, which means serious weight pressing in. She measured them with a flexible tape measure she got from the kitchen, 15 inches long, top of the heel to the tip of the great toe, 7.5 inches wide at the widest point across the bowl, and on the outside window sill, the narrow wooden ledge below the double-hung window, about 18 feet above the garden grade, she found a bundle of plant material that had not been there the night before. She left it in place. She called her nephew Garrett, who lives about 6 miles away, and who is the person in the family she trusts most for this kind of thing, and she told him she'd found tracks she didn't recognize under her window, and she wanted him to come look. She didn't tell him about the windowsill yet. Garrett came out that afternoon. He is in his mid-40s, a man who hunts and traps these mountains the way his father did before him, who has spent a significant portion of his life in the backcountry of Yancey and Mitchell counties, and who has the particular unhurried competence of people who know a piece of ground very well. He came out and looked at the impressions in the garden dirt, and he didn't say anything for a while. He got the folding rule from his truck, and he measured them. He wrote the measurements in a small spiral notebook he carried in his breast pocket. Then he stood up and looked at the garden fence and the pressed marigolds and the tree line beyond. He asked Nell to tell him what she had seen. She told him everything. The 3 nights, the smell, the shape at the fence on the 2nd night, the figure at the window on the 3rd night, the baby. She told it the same way she told me, methodically, without drama, letting the facts carry whatever weight they had. Garrett listened without interrupting. He stood there with his notebook open in his hand, and his eyes going from Nell to the fence, to the tree line, and back. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone in this family." Garrett had been finding sign in these mountains for 8 years. He had started finding it when he was running his winter trap line. He traps mink and muskrat along the creek drainages, and bobcat on the upper ridges when the season is right, and he had started coming across tracks in the creek mud that didn't match anything he knew. He had been trapping these mountains for more than 20 years at that point, and he knew what was in them. He knew the track of a black bear versus a dog versus a large coyote. He knew elk tracks, even though elk aren't native to this part of North Carolina anymore. They've been reintroduced in the Cataloochee Valley in Haywood County, about 30 miles southwest, and they occasionally range. But he had seen the prints from when he'd hunted out that way. He knew bobcat from domestic cat from fox. He had spent his adult life learning to read the ground these animals moved on. The tracks he started finding were not in his catalog. They were big, bipedal. The toes were visible and the shape was similar to a human foot, but distinctly not a human foot. The great toe offset, the ball wide, the stride length at a walk that put the creature's legs at significantly longer than his own, and he is 6 feet tall. He had measured them. He had photographed them with his phone over the years, many of them. He had dozens of photographs on his phone, organized by date and location. He had never told anyone because he didn't know what to say, and he was not a person who found it easy to say things he couldn't back up. He said he had spent 8 years trying to find an explanation that fit. He'd looked at every large animal possibility, bear, which didn't fit because bears don't produce bipedal tracks in that configuration. Feral human, which he'd thought about and dismissed because of the scale and because of the consistency across years and locations. Something escaped from captivity, which he'd thought about and dismissed for similar reasons. He hadn't been able to make it fit anything he knew, so he had kept quiet. But he had paid attention to where the sign appeared, and over 8 years he had started to see a pattern. The tracks appeared in 2 distinct locations and nowhere else. One was the upper drainage near the seeps, where deer and turkey watered in dry weather, year-round. The other was the lower section of the creek, closer to the farms and gardens. The lower location had sign only in summer, and only in certain years. His conclusion, which he offered tentatively, was that the lower location sign appeared in years when there was a new young one on the ridge. The being or beings that used the upper drainage came down closer to human habitation when there was a new infant. He had theories about why, but said he'd hold those for now. Nell sat with this for a minute. Then she asked him what he thought the mother had wanted from her, showing her the baby through the window. Garrett said he didn't know. He said he'd thought about it all morning since she called him, and he would be honest with her that he didn't know. But he said the most truthful thing he could offer was that the gesture, the deliberate lifting, the holding up, the waiting for Nell to look, was something that had a shape to it. It wasn't random animal behavior. It was purposeful. He asked if she had found anything else. She took him inside and showed him the bundle on the windowsill. She had brought it inside carefully, holding it the way you hold something you don't want to disturb. It was sitting on the kitchen windowsill above the sink, where she'd put it when she came in that morning. Garrett looked at it without touching it for a while. Then he said he needed to identify the plants, and Nell said she already had. She had spent some of the morning going through the field guides she kept on the shelf by the back door, 3 of them, covering the wildflowers and medicinal plants of the southern Appalachians, and she had identified both plants in the bundle. The outer layer was Galax urceolata, which is a plant that grows throughout the upper elevations of the Blue Ridge and the Black Mountains. Its leaves are round and leathery and stay green through winter, turning a deep red in the cold months and going back to dark green in spring. It's so characteristic of this part of the mountains that it has been gathered and sold commercially for use in floral arrangements for over a century. There is a documented Galax industry in the region, with families who have gathered it as a cash crop for generations. It grows on north-facing slopes, under rhododendron and on the floors of the dark hemlock coves. The inner layer was harder for Nell to place at first. She had taken a sample of it and brought it to the county extension office in Burnsville the morning of the day Garrett came, saying she had found it in the woods and wanted to know what it was. The extension agent had identified it as blue cohosh, Caulophyllum thalictroides, which is a woodland wildflower that grows in the rich, moist cove soils of the southern Appalachians. It produces a cluster of small yellow-green flowers in spring, and then a cluster of small round berries, dark bluish-black when ripe and in late summer. The root and the plant have a long history in the traditional medicine of the Cherokee people, as well as in the folk medicine of the Appalachian settlers who learned plant knowledge from them. Blue cohosh has been used for centuries in this region, among other things, as a plant medicine to support women after difficult labor and delivery. It is noted in the older ethnobotanical literature on Cherokee medicinal plants as one of the plants specifically associated with childbirth and postpartum care. Garrett looked at the bundle, and he looked at Nell, and he said, "Well," she said, "exactly." I asked Nell, when she told me all this, how she felt about what the bundle meant. She said she had thought about it for 2 years by the time she talked to me, and the conclusion she kept arriving at was the same one. Whatever had made the bundle and left it on her windowsill knew enough about what a new mother needs to choose appropriate plants. It knew the plants by name, or by whatever the equivalent of a name is for a being that doesn't use language the way we do. It gathered them and it combined them in a specific way, and it left them for her. She said she thought the bundle was for her, not for the mother. She said the mother had what she needed. What the bundle was for was the relationship. It was a reciprocal gesture, the same kind of gesture as the one she had made when she nodded. "You see me. Here is something back. Here is something that says I know something about you, too. I know what this period of life requires. I know how to think about this." Garrett went back to the upper ridge 4 days later. He went alone, which he said later he might not do again. Not because of what happened, because nothing happened in the sense of an incident, but because of how it felt. He said going alone on that ridge after knowing what Nell had seen changed the quality of every sound and every shift of shadow in the trees, and he was not sure that was the right headspace for being alone in dense mountain cover. He parked at the end of the old logging road that runs up along the left fork of the creek drainage. There's a skid trail that was cut decades ago, grown over now with alder and blackberry and young tulip poplar, passable on foot but not by anything with a motor, and he hiked in from there. It's roughly 2.5 miles to the first bench below the upper ridge, gaining somewhere around 1,200 feet of elevation. He'd made that walk many times over the years. The lower portion of the walk was ordinary. He noted what he always noted: deer sign in the rhododendron, turkey scratchings in the leaf litter on the south-facing slope sections, a coyote that had used the trail sometime in the night before the last light rain. He was paying the kind of attention he always paid on that trail, but nothing was different until he reached the section of dense old hemlock about 1.5 miles in. The hemlock grove in that drainage is unusual. Most of the hemlock in this part of the mountains has been severely damaged or killed by the woolly adelgid, a small insect pest that has been working through eastern hemlock populations in the Appalachians since the 1950s. This particular grove has fared better than most, probably because the drainage stays wet enough through summer to slow the insects' spread, and also possibly because it's been left undisturbed. It's far enough from any road that it has been logging. Impractical since before the adelgid arrived, and it's not on any trail that gets heavy foot traffic. The trees are old. Some of them are 4 and 5 feet in diameter, at breast height, which puts them well over a century old, possibly 2 centuries, possibly more. The canopy closes overhead, and inside the grove the light is dim and the ground is bare except for hemlock needles and the occasional fern growing in the wet seeps. Garrett said the quality of the quiet changed when he entered the hemlock grove. He used the word different at first, then he corrected himself and said directed, like the grove was aware of him. He said he'd felt that before in certain wild places, a sense of being tracked, being registered, being in the attention of something, and he'd learned to pay attention to it without letting it make him stupid. He kept moving at his normal pace. He kept his eyes forward and let his peripheral vision do its work. He came out of the hemlock section and onto the lower bench, which is a flat terrace in the slope that runs roughly east-west for about 1/4 mile before the ridge rises steeply again. The bench is wet in places. 2 springs emerge from the hillside above it and seep across the flat before draining off the east edge, and the ground in the wet areas is soft clay that holds impressions well. Garrett had found sign there before, over the years, but nothing like what he found this time. The wet ground along the bench held what he could only describe as a path. Not a path in the sense of a cleared trail, but a path in the sense of a regularly used route. Impressions overlapping impressions. The same area depressed repeatedly, by the same weight moving in the same direction. It ran along the eastern edge of the bench from the lower slope to the point where the ridge started climbing again. He walked alongside it, not through it, and he measured several of the clearest individual impressions. Consistent. Around 15 inches long, 7 inches across at the widest, 5 toes visible in the best examples, the great toe prominent and offset in the way Nell had described. And there were 2 sizes. The larger set he had been finding for 8 years, the smaller set he had never found before. He measured the smallest clear impression he could locate, 5.5 inches long, 3.5 inches across. The toe marks were there, 5 of them, the great toe set at the same offset angle as in the larger prints, but everything scaled down to something very small. He stood on that bench for a long time, looking at the small tracks. He'd told me, when I talked to him later, that he had not been prepared for the smallness of them. He had known, intellectually, from what Nell had told him, that there was a new infant. He had thought about what that meant in terms of tracks and sign. But standing there looking at an impression 5.5 inches long with 5 tiny toe marks set in the clay beside a large track that was nearly 3 times the length, something about it became real in a way it hadn't been. He followed the path to the point where the wet clay gave way to harder ground and the impressions faded. He spent about an hour on the bench. He photographed every clear impression with his phone and the folding rule for scale. He wrote notes on conditions, temperatures, soil state, the weather history of the preceding week that might affect how long the impressions had been holding. He was systematic. He is a systematic man. He did not go above the second bench. He had remembered while he was driving up to the property that morning the rule that had been in the family as long as he could remember it. Don't go above the second bench after dark was the version he'd grown up hearing, though in his family's telling it was framed slightly differently. Don't take the upper trail past September. Same essential instruction. Stay below a certain elevation, below a certain line that had been established by enough years of collective experience that the reason for it had mostly stopped being told. Just the rule itself, handed down. Standing at the foot of the upper slope with the path going into the thick laurel and rhododendron above him, and the smell from the night Nell had described somehow faint in his memory, even though he hadn't been there that night. He found the rule easy to observe. He turned around and walked back down. The walk down was different from the walk up. On the way up, he'd been paying the kind of attention you pay when you're going somewhere with a purpose. On the way down, the purpose was behind him, and the forest around him felt different for that. Not threatening, just present. The way a place feels when it has stopped being background and started being something you have to account for. He stopped once in the hemlock section, at a place where the trail bent around a big blowdown, a hemlock that had come down sometime in the last several years, root ball still attached, the root disc 10 feet across and 8 feet tall. He'd passed this tree dozens of times. He stopped and looked at the slope above, and he thought about 8 years of finding tracks and saying nothing. 8 years of knowing something was in those drainages and filing it in the part of his mind where he kept things he couldn't explain and had no use for explaining. He was not a superstitious man. When something didn't fit a category, his instinct was to wait until he had enough information to build the category, rather than to reach for an existing one that almost fit. 8 years had not given him enough information to build a category. He just kept accumulating data points and not knowing what to do with them. He thought about the small track, 5.5 inches, toe marks tiny in the clay. He'd laid his hand next to one of them, and his palm had covered it completely. The thing that kept turning in his mind was not the existence of whatever had left those tracks. He'd known something was up there for 8 years. He could accommodate the existence. What he couldn't stop turning over was the smallness of the tracks, and what the smallness implied. Something up there had been new recently. new and small and carried. Something up there had a mother, and the mother had come down off that ridge and stood at Nell's window and held the new thing up to the glass and waited for someone to look. He came out of the hemlock section onto the open slope, and the late summer light hit him through the hardwoods, and he stood in it for a moment. Then he went on down. He showed Nell his photographs that afternoon. They sat at the kitchen table and went through them on his phone. She looked at each one. When she got to the photographs of the small impressions, she didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "I think the labor was hard." The mother looked tired in the way women look tired after a hard delivery. Garrett said, "Yeah." She said, "The baby was healthy, though. I could tell that." He said, "That's what I was thinking." I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Garrett separately, about 2 months after my conversation with Nell. I called him on a November evening when the weather had turned and he had just come in from checking his trapline on the creek. We talked for almost 2 hours. He told me something he hadn't told Nell completely. He had been leaving things on the bench for the previous 2 months. He said he felt slightly ridiculous about it, and also that it felt correct, and he had decided to trust the second feeling. The first time he had left a piece of salt-cured venison from his own previous deer season, wrapped in a square of clean muslin, set on a flat rock at the edge of the wet clay. He had come back 2 weeks later. The muslin was there, folded. The meat was gone. He had thought about what to leave next for about 3 weeks. He was aware that he was in territory, culturally and practically, that he didn't have good guidance for. He said he kept thinking about what Nell had said about the bundle, the reciprocal nature of it, the sense that something appropriate to the situation had been offered. He wanted to be appropriate to the situation, and he wasn't sure what that looked like. From his side. In late August, he gathered galax and blue cohosh from the lower slope, the same 2 plants from the bundle, tied them the way he thought the bundle had been tied, based on Nell's description, and left them on the flat rock. He came back 10 days later. The bundle was gone. In its place on the rock was a single galax leaf, fresh picked. On the smooth upper surface of the leaf, something had pressed a mark. He described it as 2 curved lines facing each other, like parentheses, with a short horizontal mark between them. He said it looked something like an eye, though he was aware that was probably his own interpretation of a shape that might mean something entirely different. He brought the leaf down. He dried it flat between pieces of cardboard, and he still had it. He couldn't tell me what the mark meant. He said he had looked at it from different angles and in different light conditions, and he didn't have an answer. He had accepted that he might never have one. He told me that since the first exchange on the flat rock, he had made 4 more visits to the bench, leaving small things each time, once a bundle of the medicinal plants, once a piece of the venison, once a handful of dried apples from his family's old orchard, and once nothing, just a visit. All 4 times he had found something on the rock when he returned. 3 times the galax leaf with a pressed mark on it, each mark slightly different from the others. Once a small object he described carefully, a length of grapevine about 8 inches long, with the bark partly stripped in a spiral pattern. He had brought that down, too. He kept it with the leaves. He said he didn't know what any of it meant, in the sense of being able to translate it into a sentence. But he said it felt like something. It felt like the beginning of a grammar he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, and he thought that might be the best he could do. He said he thought of Nell's nod through the window. That had been a communication, too, a clear and simple one, and it had been received and responded to. He thought maybe that was the scale of it, simple, clear, appropriate to the situation. Don't try to say more than you know how to say. I want to tell you about Norris. Norris is a man in his 70s who spent most of his working life as a timber cruiser in Yancey and Mitchell counties. Timber cruising, for anyone who doesn't know the term, is the work of going into a piece of standing forest and estimating the volume of marketable timber, walking the ground, identifying species, measuring trees, recording conditions, producing an inventory of what's there. It's solitary, methodical work that puts you on remote ground regularly, often far from any trail or road, often alone. Norris did this work for 30 years, starting in his mid-20s and running through his mid-50s, when he took a part-time retirement and started working only for a few long-time clients. He is a careful man. The nature of his work required precision and honesty. A timber cruise that overestimates or underestimates by a significant margin is a professional failure, and in 30 years of this work he had built a reputation for accuracy. He told me, almost as a preamble to everything else he said, that he was not a person who saw things that weren't there. He had found tracks in these mountains over those 30 years, similar to what Garrett described, large, bipedal, the shape and stride wrong for anything in the standard wildlife guides. He had found them in perhaps a dozen locations across the 2 counties over his career, most of them in the upper drainages, most of them in wet ground near the headwater seeps. He had never found an explanation that satisfied him. He had never told anyone because he didn't know how to frame it without sounding like a person who couldn't be trusted. And in his profession, that was not a reputation he could afford. He had also found structures. He said this carefully, and I want to repeat it carefully, because he was precise about what he meant and what he didn't mean. He had found, on 2 separate occasions in 2 different drainage systems, arrangements of wood that he could not attribute to wind or weather or animal behavior. He described them as constructed. One was in a section of hemlock and rhododendron in the upper part of a small drainage whose name I'm not going to use, at an elevation of about 4,200 feet. It involved several large branches, each roughly 3 to 4 inches in diameter, arranged across a low boulder in a way that formed a lean-to shape, propped against the uphill side of the rock, angled toward the prevailing winter wind direction, interlocked in a way that suggested the joints had been deliberately fitted. He had built rough shelters in the backcountry himself, over decades of remote work, and he said the arrangement was cruder than what a person would make, but was clearly the same class of object. The other instance was more striking. A standing dead chestnut oak, American chestnut oaks, Quercus montana, being the characteristic ridge tree in this part of the Black Mountains, had been twisted off at about 8 feet above the ground. He said he used the word twisted carefully, because he had looked at the break, and it was not a clean snap. The wood was spiraled, as if the trunk had been torqued until the fibers failed, rotating the upper section before it separated. The trunk at the break point was around 10 inches in diameter. An American chestnut oak at that dimension is dense, hard wood. He had thought about the force required to produce that kind of failure, and he had not been able to arrive at a satisfying number. Branches from the broken-off upper section were arranged below it in a way that looked purposeful. He told me he had photographed neither of these findings. He said he had thought about pulling out his phone both times and had decided against it. He said he was not sure he could explain why exactly. He said it felt like the right call. There was one more thing he told me, almost as an afterthought, at the end of our second conversation. He said he'd almost left it out because it was the part he was least certain about. The part where his own careful habit of sticking to what he could verify started to break down. It happened in the winter of what he thinks was 2004, though it might have been 2003 or 2005, because winters blur together when you've spent enough of them doing the same work in the same country. He was on the upper portion of a drainage he'd been cruising for 2 weeks, working through a section of mature hardwood on a northeast-facing slope that was slow-going because of the depth of the snow. He was alone, as he almost always was, and he had about an hour of usable daylight left when he stopped to take a final set of measurements on a big yellow poplar at the edge of a seep. He heard something, not a branch falling, which you hear constantly in winter when ice-loaded limbs let go. Not a deer moving through the understory. This was a vocalization. He said the word carefully, and then said, "I know how that sounds." But that's what it was. Something up the slope, maybe 200 yards above him in the timber, made a sound that was unlike anything he'd heard in 30 years of working those mountains. He described it for me in pieces, the way you describe something that doesn't have a ready comparison. He said it was low, lower than he'd expect from anything the size of a deer. It had a quality that made him think of a person trying to communicate across a distance without shouting, a carrying quality, a deliberateness of pitch, like the sound had been shaped. It lasted about 4 or 5 seconds. Then it stopped. He stood next to the poplar with his clipboard and he didn't move. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Then it happened again, same sound, same direction, but shorter. Maybe 2 seconds, and then nothing. The birds had stopped. The seep ran in a thin trickle under ice at the edges, and that was the only sound. He waited 5 more minutes and walked out in the last of the daylight, faster than he usually did. He wrote it in his field notes that night with the date and location and weather conditions. He described the sound as best he could and noted no identification. He had kept those field notes for 30 years in boxes in his basement and had not looked at that entry again until talking to me. He told me that hearing about Nell's experience had not so much changed his memory of the sound as given the memory a context. He still couldn't tell you what made it, but now he had some idea of who. He had heard the phrase, "the old people of the ridge." He said he had heard it from older residents of the remote communities, people whose families had farmed the same ground for 5 and 6 generations, who had the particular relationship to a place that comes from that kind of depth. He said the phrase wasn't used dramatically. It was more informational. The way you'd say there are bears on that ridge or that spring runs dry in August, a factual statement about conditions on the ground that you passed on because it was useful for people who were going to operate in that country. He said the understanding behind the phrase, as far as he had been able to piece it together over 30 years of working in that country and listening to the older people in it, was roughly, there is something on the high ground that was here before us, and that has its own claim on the upper ridge. We have our claim on the lower ground. The arrangement holds as long as both sides observe it. He said he had always thought the rules made sense as rules, regardless of what they were based on. You don't go above the second bench after dark. You don't bother the seeps in the hot months. You don't make a fire on the upper ridge. These were reasonable rules for human behavior on that ground, rules that kept people from doing things that would be intrusive or dangerous, and they had been maintained long enough that they'd become part of the culture of the place, without needing explicit justification. He had observed them without thinking about them much. He told me, at the end of our conversation, that knowing what Nell had seen changed how he thought about all of it. He said he had spent 30 years maintaining a certain careful agnosticism about what he was finding, telling himself it might be explainable, telling himself he simply didn't have enough data. He said after hearing Nell's account and hearing about Garrett's findings on the bench, he found that he no longer felt like maintaining that agnosticism was honest. He thought something was up there. He thought it had always been up there, and that people in these mountains had known it for as long as people had been living in these mountains, and that the knowledge had been handled the way people handle knowledge about things that are real, but that don't fit comfortably into the categories of the world as most people understand it, passed down through behavior rather than through explanation, embedded in rules rather than in stories, respected without being named. He said, "For whatever it's worth, I never felt threatened out there." In 30 years of going into those drainages and finding what I found, I never felt like whatever left those signs was interested in doing me harm. I felt watched sometimes, I felt like I was in someone's territory, and they knew I was there, but not threatened. There's a difference, and I think the people who set those rules understood the difference. I want to tell you about the history of this piece of ground, because I think it matters. Yancey County sits within the ancestral territory of the Cherokee people. The Cherokee had lived in and around these mountains for thousands of years before European contact, and their presence in the southern Appalachians is documented in their oral histories, in the accounts of early European explorers and traders, and in the archaeological record of the region. The town of Burnsville is within a region the Cherokee knew well, and the drainages of the Black Mountains and the South Toe watershed were part of a landscape they understood with the depth that comes from thousands of years of careful attention. The Cherokee removal of 1838 and 1839, the forced displacement of tens of thousands of Cherokee people from their ancestral territory in the southeast to Indian territory in present-day Oklahoma, did not end Cherokee presence in these mountains. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, which is the federally recognized tribal nation based at the Qualla boundary in Jackson and Swain counties in North Carolina, is composed of the descendants of Cherokee people who resisted removal, who hid in these mountains, who held out and eventually secured the legal right to remain on a small fraction of their territory. They have been here continuously. In Cherokee oral tradition, as recorded by ethnographers beginning in the late 19th century, and as shared by Cherokee scholars and cultural authorities who have chosen to discuss this publicly, there are accounts of non-human persons in these mountains, large hair-covered person-shaped beings that inhabit the forested ridges and the remote drainages. The Cherokee traditions around these beings are complex and specific. They are not simply monsters or bogeymen. They are persons with their own territories and their own social arrangements and their own relationships with the human communities that share the landscape. They have names in the Cherokee language. They have specific behavioral attributes that the Cherokee people observed and recorded in oral tradition over many centuries. I am not Cherokee, and it is not my place to interpret those traditions or to claim that what Nell saw through her window is definitively the same entity that Cherokee oral tradition describes. That is a connection that should be drawn, if at all, by people with the standing to draw it. What I can say is that the tradition of recognizing non-human persons in these mountains, persons with legitimate territorial claims, persons who operate by their own rules and who expect those rules to be respected, persons with whom human communities can have a relationship built on mutual acknowledgement, is not a European tradition. It did not arrive with the settlers who cleared the cove forests and built the farms. It was here, before them. Whatever those settlers learned about the old people of the ridge, they learned it from people who had been learning it for thousands of years. I have thought about Nell's account in the context of all of this, and I want to tell you what I keep coming back to. The mother came to the window 3 nights in a row. The first night she moved through the garden. The second night she stood at the fence and looked at the house. The third night she came to the window directly. This was a progression. She came closer each night. She was taking the time to be recognized, to establish her presence before she presented what she needed to present. That is not random animal behavior. That is not even particularly sophisticated animal behavior in the way we usually think about animal behavior. What she did was closer to what a person does when they want to approach someone unfamiliar with a request. You don't walk straight up and say what you need, especially if the request is significant. You let the other person see you first. You give them time to adjust. You let the relationship develop enough to support what you need to ask. She was patient about it. 3 nights, each one a step closer. And the bundle she left afterward was appropriate. It was site-specific. Galax is specific to this elevation and this region. It was medicinally knowledgeable. Blue cohosh is specific to postpartum care. It was placed correctly, on the exterior sill below the window, accessible to Nell, not inside the house. It was left as a response to Nell's nod, which is to say it was a response to a specific social gesture with another social gesture. This required awareness. It required the kind of awareness that involves theory of mind, knowing that Nell saw the baby, knowing that Nell signaled acknowledgement, knowing that the appropriate response to that acknowledgement was a reciprocal gesture, knowing what a reciprocal gesture in this context should consist of. I don't know what to call that. It's more than instinct. It's more than conditioning. It requires understanding that another being has an interior life, has needs, has the capacity to receive a communication and respond to it. It requires understanding that communication is possible across what would seem to be an enormous gap in kind. Garrett's exchange on the flat rock has the same quality. Something left material, something received material, something responded with its own material. The mark on the galax leaf was deliberate. Two curved lines and a horizontal mark do not occur on the smooth, waxy surface of a galax leaf by accident. It was put there intentionally, using something capable of fine pressure control, by something that wanted it to be found, a grammar. That was Garrett's word, the beginning of a grammar he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. I think about that phrase a lot. A grammar requires that both parties understand there is a grammar. It requires that both parties are trying to say something to each other. It requires that both parties acknowledge the other as the kind of thing that can say and receive things. Whatever is on that ridge has acknowledged the people on the lower slope as the kind of things that can say and receive things. It has been doing so through rules and behavior and occasional direct contact for long enough that it's become part of the culture of living in these mountains, without most people in these mountains being fully aware of it. Don't go above the second bench after dark. That rule has been in this family and in the families around it for longer than anyone can trace. It has been observed without question, without being given a full explanation, because the people who passed it down knew that the explanation wasn't necessary. What was necessary was the observation of the rule, because the rule was part of the agreement, and the agreement was what kept things stable. I want to tell you about the second summer. Nell was watching for it the following July, the summer after the window encounter. She had the east window open again. She left it open every night in July and August. Roy was sleeping upstairs by that point, his knee finally well enough for the stairs, and she had told him the whole story, all 3 nights, the baby, the bundle, everything. He had listened, and she said he had not said much afterward, which was not unusual for Roy, who processed things slowly and thoroughly. Eventually he had said, "All right," and then, a few days later, he had said, "If she comes back, let her know we're not going to bother anything on the upper ridge." He said it the way he said most things, quietly and with finality. She told me about that moment specifically, about the way he sat with what she'd told him before he said anything. He hadn't interrupted. He hadn't asked her to back up or clarify or explain the part about the hands on the fence rail, which she'd offered and then waited through. He just listened the way he listened to everything, with that whole body stillness. When she was done, he sat at the kitchen table and held his coffee cup and looked out the window at the garden for a long time. Then he said, "All right," and 2 days later, the second thing. She said she'd been on the porch when he came back from checking the water line at the barn, which took him past the lower edge of the garden fence. He came up the steps and said, without preamble, that if she comes back, let her know we're not going to bother anything on the upper ridge. Nell said, "I asked him how exactly I was supposed to communicate that to her." He thought about it for a minute. Then he said, "You did fine the first time." That was Roy. 60-some years of farming this piece of ground, and he had filed the situation under things that required a particular kind of response. And the particular kind of response was the same one you gave any neighbor who'd shown you something personal and uncertain. You acknowledged it, and you made clear that you intended to hold up your end, and then you went on with the work. Nell kept the east window open all through that July, and all through August. The smell never came. The marigold row was not pressed. She went to the bench twice during that time, not with Garrett but alone, just to the lower bench, not above it, and she found tracks in the wet clay each time, consistent with the prior summer. Both sizes. The smaller ones were notably bigger. She judged them at closer to 8 or 9 inches. The infant was growing. On the last day of August, she left something on the flat rock herself, without telling Garrett. She brought galax from the lower slope and some goldenrod, which was blooming along the creek bank at that time of year, and she wrapped them together and left them on the rock. She went back a week later. There was a galax leaf on the rock with a pressed mark, and next to the rock, hanging from the low branch of a serviceberry that grew at the edge of the bench, there was something else, a length of cord, not modern cord, not nylon or synthetic, but something twisted from plant fiber in the way things were twisted before there were stores, about 12 inches long with a small object bound into one end. The object was a piece of polished mica. Mica is abundant in this part of the mountains. There are old mica mines throughout Yancey and Mitchell counties, some of them dating back to the 19th century and earlier, with evidence of prehistoric extraction, predating that by thousands of years. The piece in the cord was about the size of a thumbnail, roughly hexagonal, smooth on both faces, clearly intentionally selected. Nell brought it home. It's on the shelf above the kitchen window now, next to the galax and blue cohosh bundle. She told me about it the second time I visited, and she showed it to me. I held it in my hand. The mica was cold and clear, the kind that splits into transparent sheets, and it was smooth in the way things get smooth from being handled. I asked her how she felt about having received it. She thought about that for a while. She said she felt grateful. She said that was the simplest true answer. She felt like something had been extended to her, and she was grateful to have been in a position to receive it. She said, "I've been on this property my whole life. I was born in this house. My grandmother was born in this house. There has been something on the ridge the whole time. My mother knew it. Her mother knew it, back as far as the family goes on this ground. And for most of that time, knowing it was there was something you dealt with, by observing the rules and not making a fuss. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's a reasonable way to deal with something you don't fully understand." She paused and looked out the window at the garden. "But now I know it a little differently. Not the same as knowing a person, I'm not saying that, but differently than I knew it before. And differently feels like more than I had before." She picked up the cup from the shelf, just turned it over in her hands, set it back. She said Roy had started leaving things on the trail up to the lower bench. Just small things. Last fall's apples from the orchard, pieces of cured meat wrapped in muslin. He was methodical about it. He wrote the dates and contents in a small notebook he kept on the kitchen counter, the same kind of spiral notebook Garrett used. She said he had started doing it without talking to her about it, and when she found the notebook, she asked him about it, and he said, it seemed like the right thing to do. That was Roy. I've thought about all of this for more than a year now. I've talked to several other people in the course of trying to understand it, people who have lived and worked in these mountains, and I want to tell you about 2 of them before I finish. The first is a woman I'll call Darlene, who is in her early 60s and who grew up on the Cane River, which is the next watershed north of the South Toe. She spent her childhood on a farm there and then left for nursing school and spent most of her adult life in Asheville. She retired a few years ago and came back to the county. She's a practical, level-headed woman, not unlike Nell in temperament. Darlene told me that her father had seen something on the upper ridge of their property when she was a child. He had gone up to check on the cattle in a high pasture they used in summer, and he had come back early, and he had been quiet for the rest of the day and that evening. He had not talked about what he saw, not then. It was years later, when Darlene was in her 20s and visiting home for a holiday, that he told her. He had been moving through the timber at the upper edge of the pasture when he smelled something, and the smell had stopped him. He said it was an animal smell, but bigger than any animal he knew. He stood still and waited, because he had grown up being told that when you smell something on the upper ridge and don't know what it is, you stand still, and you let it pass. His father had told him that, and his grandfather before him. After a while, he heard something moving in the timber above him. Moving on two legs, he said, moving deliberately and without hurry. He heard it for about a minute, moving parallel to the tree line above the pasture, and then angling up the slope away from him. It never came into view. When it was gone, the cattle that had been near the upper gate moved away from the gate and down toward the lower pasture, which they wouldn't normally do until he drove them. He came back down. He never talked about it publicly. He told Darlene because he thought she should know what was on that ridge, since she was going to inherit the property eventually. She told me she had thought about it often after he died. She felt the weight of having received it, not as something frightening, but as something she was now responsible for. She observed the rule. She said whatever is up there has been up there since before her family came to the county in the 1840s, and it hasn't done anything to them in nearly 200 years. Maybe it means the rules work, or maybe it means they've been lucky. She smiled when she said that last part. But I think it means the rules work. The other person is a man I'll call Eustace, who is in his late 50s and who works for the Pisgah National Forest on the ranger district that covers part of the Black Mountains area. He has worked in that forest for almost 30 years. I'm not going to say more specifically who he is or what his position is, because he spoke to me without official authorization and with the clear understanding that I would protect his identity. He told me that in his career on the ranger district, he had dealt with 2 incidents involving members of the public who reported unusual encounters in the back country. Both incidents were in the same general part of the district, the upper drainages on the northeast flank of the range, not far from the area Nell and Garrett's property backs up against, though further into the national forest. The first incident was a backpacker who came out of the backcountry 2 days early, looking shaken, and who reported, when asked, that he had heard something large moving near his camp on 2 consecutive nights, had smelled something he couldn't identify, and on the second night had seen, by the light of his headlamp from the entrance to his tent, 2 points of light at a height he estimated at between 7 and 9 feet, maybe 40 feet from his tent, in the trees above his camp. The lights had not behaved the way eyeshine normally behaved. They had not reflected the headlamp beam in the way that most animal eyeshine reflects, but had rather seemed to absorb it, appearing as 2 dull points rather than bright, reflective spots. He had watched them for about 3 minutes, and then they had moved, slowly, and disappeared into the tree cover above. He had been a backpacker for many years, he said, and he was not someone who startled easily, but the experience had unnerved him enough that he'd packed out at first light. Eustace had taken the report seriously. He'd gone into that section of the backcountry the following week with a colleague, and they had found, at the location the backpacker described, a soft area of ground near a seep where there were impressions. He measured several of them, large, bipedal, the shape consistent with the accounts I've described. He had photographed them. He had written a brief internal report noting the findings and suggesting that the area warranted additional monitoring. He told me the report had not gone anywhere in particular. It had been filed. It had not been acted on. And he had been told in a brief conversation with a supervisor that unusual wildlife observations were best left to state wildlife resources unless there was evidence of a public safety issue. He had left the internal report in his files, He told me he had added to it over the years. He had 2 more instances of similar tracks from the same general area, found during routine trail maintenance work. He had not submitted additional reports. He kept the file for his own reference. The second public incident was a family, 2 adults and 2 older children, who had been camping in the backcountry and who came out of the woods in the morning before they were due to leave and went to the visitor center. The adults had heard something circling their camp for several hours in the night, moving on 2 legs, something that was very large by its sound. At one point, the circling had stopped and something had stood very near their tent for a period they estimated at about 15 minutes before moving away. The children had slept through it. The adults had been awake and listening the whole time and had not slept further that night. They had also found in the morning before they left their campsite something placed at the edge of the cleared tent area near where they had stacked their bear canister. A branch, roughly 2 feet long, with several smaller branches arranged off it in a shape that one of the adults said looked like an arrow pointing toward the trailhead. They had not placed it. They were certain of this. Eustace said he had gone to the campsite after the family reported. He had found tracks in the soft ground around the perimeter of the site consistent with what he'd found before. He had also found the branch arrangement, which the family had not disturbed. He looked at it for a while, and then he left it in place and went back out. He added the incident to his file. He told me he had come to a conclusion over the course of his career, and he stated it simply. There is something in the high country of that ranger district that has been there for a long time, and that is aware of human presence in its territory, and that responds to that presence in specific ways. He did not believe it was dangerous, based on 30 years of evidence, including 2 public incidents in which it had ample opportunity to cause harm and had not done so. He believed it was territorial, in the sense of being aware of and responding to what happened on a specific piece of ground. He believed it communicated, in some fashion, with people who were in its territory, and he believed that the tradition of keeping specific behaviors in mind when operating on the upper ridges, a tradition that he had encountered in conversations with old-time residents of the county over his career, reflected genuine accumulated knowledge about how to be in that territory without causing a problem. He said he had observed those rules himself. Not the second bench rule specifically, because his work took him above the second bench regularly, but the spirit of the rules, awareness, courtesy, non-intrusion on whatever the upper drainages contained. He said in 30 years he had never had a problem. He said one more thing. He said, "I think the thing that people miss when they talk about these encounters is that the encounters are two-sided. Whatever is out there is making choices about how to engage with the people who enter its territory. It chooses when to make itself known and when to stay hidden. It has been making those choices for a very long time, and consistently, toward minimal disruption and maximum information exchange on its own terms. That's not an animal," he said. "That's something that has a deliberate relationship with human communities maintained over centuries. And I don't think most people are ready to sit with what that actually means. I've been sitting with it for more than a year now, and the thing that comes back to me most consistently is not the scale of it, not the strangeness of it. It's the patience. Whatever is on that ridge has been waiting and watching and maintaining the arrangement, and occasionally extending something across the gap, a bundle of plants on a windowsill, a galax leaf with a mark pressed into it, for a very long time. Long enough that the rules for living alongside them have stopped being explained and have just become part of how you live on that ground." Nell said something near the end of our second conversation that I keep coming back to. She said, "You know what I think? I think she knew the family had been on this property for a long time. I think she knew that we knew the rules and had been keeping them. And I think that when she had a new baby, she wanted to come down from the ridge and show it to someone who had been a good neighbor. I think that's right. I think the mother came down because The relationship was old enough and solid enough, and the people on that particular piece of lower slope had been respectful enough for long enough that she felt the gesture was possible, that it would be received, that she had a neighbor she could trust with it. Nell received it. She nodded. She looked. That's all it took. There's a specific quality of trust that gets built over generations, not between individuals. Individuals die. Memories fade. The specific details get lost. But a trust built into the way a community lives on a piece of ground, into the rules it observes, into the habits it maintains without being explicitly told why. That kind of trust is real, and it accumulates, and apparently it can be felt from the other side of the agreement. Don't go above the second bench after dark. Don't bother the seeps in August. Leave the upper trail alone after September. These are the deposits into an account. The balance accumulates, and eventually something comes to the window in the dark and holds up something new and waits to be seen. Nell still has the bundle on the shelf above the kitchen window. She still has the mica piece on the cord next to the bundle. She still leaves the east window open in summer. Roy still leaves things on the trail, up to the lower bench, in the small notebook with the dates and contents. He does it quietly and consistently, the way he does most things. Garrett goes to the bench on his own schedule. He brings the folding rule. He photographs the tracks. He leaves something on the flat rock and he comes back to see what's there. The small tracks have continued to grow. By his last visit, they were close to 11 inches. The infant, if that's the right word, is not an infant anymore. I go back to Nell's house when I can. I sit at the kitchen table and we drink coffee and we talk about the garden and the family and whatever the season brings. Before I leave, I stand on the porch for a while and look at the tree line. The slope above the garden fence goes up through the hardwoods to the hemlock section, and beyond that to the ridge. Nothing moves, usually. Nothing is visible. But something is up there, in those dark hemlocks, and the laurel and the pitch pine on the upper ridge. And it has been up there for a very long time, and it knows the schedule of the farm below it. And it has decided, apparently, that the people on that farm are worth knowing. I find I'm glad it decided that. The marigolds are planted every year, in the same row, along the outside of the fence because the deer don't like the smell. By late July, they're tall and full and bright, and on some mornings in that heat, when the ground is soft from a recent rain, there is a pressed-down section along the outside of that row, 10 feet wide, where something came to the fence in the night and stood looking at the house. Nell finds it in the mornings. She checks. She straightens whatever got tilted inside the fence, if anything did, and then she goes back in and makes the coffee. She does not feel afraid. She has never felt afraid of it, she told me. Not from the first night. She said the smell was startling, and the shape of the fence was startling, and the figure at the window was startling, in the sense that she hadn't expected any of it, but not frightening. She said there was something in all of it that didn't read as threatening. It read as careful, as considered, as something that had thought about how to do what it was doing in a way that minimized alarm. She thinks about that sometimes, the deliberateness of it, the 3 nights of approach, each one slightly closer, giving her time to adjust to each new level of proximity before the next one. The patience of it, the way it stood at the fence and looked at the house without approaching until she had had enough time to see it and not be overwhelmed by seeing it. She said it knew what it was doing. It had done this before, or something like it. It knew how to approach without producing panic. That takes knowledge of the thing being approached. That takes knowledge of us. And that, she said, is the thing I've been sitting with for 2 years. It knows us. Whatever is on that ridge, it knows us. It knows how we move and when we sleep, and what kind of light we need to see clearly, and how close is too close, and what a nod means when a woman wakes up in the dark and leans toward a window. It has been paying attention to us for a long time. It has accumulated that knowledge the same way we have accumulated the rules, generation by generation, slowly, through careful observation. And one night in late July, when it had something new and small and important to show, it chose a window it knew, a house it knew, a woman who had spent her whole life within sight of the ridge, who had grown up with the rules, who had kept them faithfully, who could be trusted to look without running. She looked. That seems like the right ending for this story. Not a dramatic one, not a shocking one, just a woman and a window and the dark outside it, and something that had been patient for a very long time, finally showing what it needed to show. She looked, and in the morning there was a bundle of galax and blue cohosh on the outside windowsill, placed there by something that understood what new mothers need, left for the woman who had looked. She keeps it on the shelf above the kitchen window. She has no plans to take it down. I want to go back to something about this region that I think matters. The ethnobotanist James Mooney, who worked extensively with the eastern band of Cherokee in the 1880s and 1890s, and whose accounts remain foundational sources for Cherokee traditional knowledge, documented a range of beliefs and practices connected to the non-human persons of the mountain forests. He was careful to note that these were persons, in the Cherokee understanding, beings with their own intentions and their own social arrangements and their own territories, not demons or monsters, not animals. They were called various things in different contexts and by different communities of Cherokee people. Some of those names are in the public record, others are not shared publicly for reasons of cultural protocol. What is in the public record is the nature of the relationship. The high forests, the remote drainages, the upper ridges above certain elevations, these were understood by the Cherokee people as being occupied by beings who had their own claim on that country and who could be in relationship with human communities under the right conditions and with the right protocols. The protocols involved respect. They involved not intruding on certain spaces at certain times. They involved specific behaviors when you entered those spaces. They involved acknowledgement, a word I keep coming back to. You acknowledged that you were in someone else's territory. You announced yourself. You did not take more than you needed. You left when you were supposed to leave, and in return, the beings of the upper forest largely left the human communities of the lower slopes alone, and occasionally, on terms they set, acknowledged the humans back. I am not saying that what Nell experienced was a Cherokee cultural encounter, because that is not my knowledge to interpret. What I am saying is that the tradition of living alongside these beings, of understanding the rules of that coexistence, of accumulating the knowledge of how to be a good neighbor to whatever inhabits the high ground, that tradition did not originate with the European settlers who came to these mountains in the 18th and 19th centuries. They arrived in a landscape that was already organized around this reality. They learned the rules, or they learned enough of the rules to survive, from people who had been learning them for millennia. The phrase "the old people of the ridge," which Nell grew up with and which Norris heard from the long-tenured residents of these communities, is an English-language placeholder for something that was understood much more completely in Cherokee. The English settlers took a partial understanding and compressed it into a phrase they could pass on, and over generations that phrase lost most of its context and kept only the practical instruction. Something is on the upper ridge. It is old. It is not us. Observe the rules. Nell observed the rules. And one night in late July, the other side of the arrangement acknowledged her. I want to tell you about the last thing Garrett told me, because I think it changes the shape of the whole story. He called me in early March of the year after my second visit to Nell. Early March in these mountains is still winter at elevation. The seeps on the upper bench would be frozen or half-frozen. The rhododendron leaves curled tight against the cold, the hemlocks dark against the snow on the ground under them. He had not been on the bench since November. He had been up to the lower portion of the trail that day, below the bench, just checking. He runs a rabbit snare in that section in winter. Nothing elaborate, just 2 or 3 sets. He checks every week or so. He came back with something he'd found at the foot of the old hemlock section, at the edge of the timber where the open slope begins. Left on a rock, placed there, he was certain of it. Not fallen, not a piece of debris. Placed. It was a piece of bark. American basswood bark, he said. Tilia americana, which is one of the cove forest trees, soft inner bark that peels in flexible layers. The piece was roughly 8 inches by 6. On the smooth inner surface of the bark, something had pressed marks. Not random impressions, not damage from handling. Marks that covered most of the interior surface in a pattern of lines and curves, and what he could only describe as symbols, though he had no framework for what they might mean. He photographed it on his phone before he touched it. Then he brought it home carefully and dried it flat. He sent me the photographs. I sat with those photographs for a long time. I am not a linguist or an anthropologist, and I have no framework for interpreting the marks. But they were clearly not random. They were clearly intentional. They were distributed across the bark surface in a pattern that had organization to it. Certain marks clustered together, certain marks repeating in multiple locations, negative space around groupings that was clearly a structural choice. Something had made them with care, over what must have been a sustained effort. Garrett had shown them to a person he knew through a hunting acquaintance, a man who worked in archaeological interpretation at a state historic site, not in this specific county, but nearby. He was not going to put this person's name on any kind of record, and neither am I. The person looked at the photographs for a long time without saying anything. Then he said he wasn't able to tell Garrett what the marks meant, because he didn't know. But he could tell Garrett that they were not consistent with any documented pre-contact symbol system he was familiar with from the southeastern Appalachians. They were also, he said, not random, and not the kind of thing that occurs naturally. Something made them deliberately. He asked Garrett where he had found them. Garrett told him, broadly, the upper drainage of a specific watershed in Yancey County. The man was quiet for a moment and then said, "There are things in those upper drainages that people have been knowing about for a long time, and there are reasons why certain parcels in that district haven't been opened to timbering or recreational development even when the economics would have supported it." He didn't say anything else about it. Garrett brought the bark home and put it with the galax leaves and the mica piece on the cord. He said they were accumulating a small collection of things on his kitchen shelf that he didn't have a category for. He said it with a kind of wry acceptance. This is the life I apparently have now, and I'm okay with that. He said he planned to keep going to the bench, as long as the invitation seemed to be open. He was not going to push above the second bench. He was not going to try to set up any kind of remote camera or recording device, which he said he'd thought about and decided against. He said it felt like a violation of whatever the arrangement was. If something is going to communicate with you on its own terms, you don't unilaterally try to capture that communication on your terms. That's not how a relationship works. He was going to keep showing up and leaving appropriate things on the rock and seeing what came back. He was going to keep writing everything down in his notebook. And he was going to keep the benchmarks measured, so he could tell when the young one's tracks changed to the next stage. He said, "I think we're going to be doing this for a long time. It's not a one-time thing. It was there before us, and will be there after us. We're just," he paused and found the word, "participating in our generation of it. Our generation of it." I've been thinking about that phrase for months. The idea that each generation of people on that piece of ground participates in its generation of this ongoing relationship, and then passes it down, and the next generation participates in their generation of it. The accumulation of that, across the generations, is what produces the rules. What produces the old people of the ridge, the don't go above the second bench after dark, the leave the upper seeps alone. What produces, eventually, a situation where a mother can come to a specific window and hold a baby up to a specific woman and know somehow that the woman on the other side of that glass will look and nod and understand. That is a long time in the making. I want to be honest about the limits of what I know and what I've been able to verify. None of what I've told you is formally documented in the way that would satisfy a scientific standard of evidence. The tracks exist in photographs on Garrett's phone, which Garrett showed me. The bundle exists on Nell's shelf, which I held in my hands. The bark piece exists in Garrett's collection of things without categories. Eustace's file exists in a filing cabinet in a ranger district office, internal, never submitted to anyone who might act on it. Norris's findings exist in his memory, which is clear and specific, but not in writing anywhere. None of this can be confirmed externally. None of it rises to the level of proof in the sense that the word is used in a scientific or legal context. I know that. I've thought about it carefully, because I think the people I talk to deserve that care. And here is where I arrive, after more than a year of thinking. The people I talk to are not liars, and they are not people who get confused about what they see and experience. They are working people, careful people, people whose professional and daily lives depend on accurate observation and honest reporting. Nell was a practical nurse for 40 years. Garrett is a trapper and outdoorsman whose living depends on reading the ground correctly. Norris spent 30 years producing timber inventories that had to be accurate. Darlene was a nurse. Eustace works in forest management. None of them came to me. I came to most of them, following threads from Nell's initial account. None of them seemed eager to tell their stories. Most of them had held the stories for years or decades before talking to me. Their accounts are internally consistent with each other and with a broader body of accounts from this same general region going back well over a century, some of them in the published ethnographic and naturalist literature. I believe them. I don't know what the mother was who came to Nell's window. I know she was real. I know she was large and dark-haired and bipedal, and had hands and a face with an expression, and that she had a new infant that she held up to a second-story window in the dark because she wanted someone to see it. I know she knew enough to leave a specific medicinal plant on the windowsill as a response to a nod. That is what I know. And I know that on the upper bench above Nell and Roy's property, a set of small tracks that were 5.5 inches long 2 years ago are now close to 11 inches. The young one is growing up in those dark hemlocks, and that laurel, and that pitch pine. And sometime in the next years it will be large enough to make its own choices about what to do and what not to do with the people on the lower slope. And the people on the lower slope will still be there, still making their small deposits into the account, still observing the rules they received without being told all the reasons for them. And in that way, whatever happened at the east window 2 years ago will pass from one generation of the arrangement to the next, Nell and Roy and Garrett on their side, whoever is up on that ridge on the other side, and the understanding between them, partial, wordless, built from small gestures left on flat rocks and windowsills, and the simple act of looking clearly at something you hadn't expected to see, will carry forward into the next generation, and maybe the one after that, the way it has carried forward through all the generations before. That's the whole story I have to tell you. There is one more thing. When I came back to visit Nell that second time, in early spring, before the leaves had come in, she walked me to the east-facing window on the ground floor. Not the second-story window, but the kitchen window, the one above the shelf where she keeps the bundle and the mica piece. She pointed out the window at the garden and the fence and the tree line, and she said she wanted me to see something. On the outside of the garden fence, on the fence post at the corner closest to the house, the post that stood roughly 15 feet from where the footprints had been found under the upper window, someone had pressed a mark into the wood. She had found it 2 weeks after the third night that previous July, and she hadn't mentioned it to me during our first conversation. She wasn't sure why she'd held it back. She thought maybe she needed more time with it before she could share it. The mark was pressed into the old gray wood of the chestnut fence post, not cut or carved, but pressed, as if something had applied sustained pressure to a small surface area, a finger, maybe, or a claw, something pointed and capable of controlled force. The impression was shallow but clear, 2 curved lines facing each other, like parentheses, with a short horizontal mark between them, the same shape Garrett had found pressed into the galax leaf on the flat rock. She ran her finger along it, standing there in the early spring light with the garden still bare around us. The shape was a 1/4 inch deep in wood that had been standing outside for decades. I looked at it for a long time. I don't know what it means. Nobody I've spoken to knows what it means. Maybe it's a mark specific to an individual, the way an animal marks its territory, but more precise and intentional than that. Maybe it means something in a communication system that is entirely internal to whatever uses it. Maybe it means simply, this is mine, or I was here, or I know this place. Maybe it means something I have no framework to interpret. But it is on the fence post at the corner of the garden, and it is on the galax leaves that come down from the bench, and they are the same shape. There is a connection. Something is using the same mark in different contexts, and whatever the mark means, it is being used consistently enough that it can be found in multiple places, left at different times, by something that is thinking in terms of a consistent symbol. That is a long way from random behavior. Nell kept her hand on the post for a moment. Then she stepped back and looked at the tree line, the dark hemlocks visible above the hardwoods now leafing out below them. She said, I feel like we're at the beginning of something. I don't know what it is, but it's been beginning for a long time, and we're in an early part of it. And maybe that's as much as any one person gets to know, your part of it, your generation of it, what happens at your window and on your section of the bench. And then you pass the rules down, and the next person has their part. She turned away from the window and went to make more coffee. I stood there a minute longer, looking at the mark on the fence post, and looking at the tree line above the garden, and thinking about what it is to have a relationship with something for which you don't have a name, on terms that neither party can fully articulate, across a distance that is much more than the distance between the farmhouse and the upper ridge. Whatever is up there has been watching this piece of ground for a very long time. Whatever is up there held a baby up to a lit window in the dark and waited for a woman to wake up and see it. Whatever is up there left a mark on a fence post and left galax leaves with the same mark pressed into them on a flat rock 2 miles up a mountain. Whatever is up there is paying attention, and on this side of the tree line, the coffee is being made, and the garden is going to be planted when the last frost passes, and the tomatoes will go in along the fence rail in late May, and the marigolds will go along the outside edge in June, and the east window will be open. It has always been open. Let me go back to the question of the plants, because I think there's more to say about it than I've said. Blue cohosh, Caulophyllum thalictroides, is not a plant that announces itself. It doesn't have a showy flower. In spring, it produces small clusters of yellow-green flowers that most people walk past without noticing. By late summer, the flowers have become clusters of dark berries on stems that turn deep blue-purple. And even then the plant is easy to miss in the understory of the cove forests where it grows. You have to know it to find it. You have to have spent time in those specific forest types. the north-facing coves with the rich, moist soil at the right time of year, looking for it. Galax is easier to find. It grows abundantly on north-facing slopes throughout the middle elevations of the Blue Ridge and the Black Mountains, and its round, leathery leaves are distinctive. But you have to know what you're looking at. You have to have enough experience with the forest floor of these mountains that you can identify a specific plant and understand what it is, and then make a decision to gather it. The combination of these two plants, in the context of a postpartum offering, is not accidental. Blue cohosh is one of the traditional Cherokee plants documented as used by midwives and herbalists to support women after difficult deliveries. Galax has its own uses in traditional healing contexts, though it is also culturally significant in the region in other ways. It has been central to the gift economy of the southern Appalachian communities, gathered and sold, woven into funeral wreaths and holiday decorations and bridal arrangements for well over a century. It is a plant deeply embedded in the culture of these mountains. The person or being that assembled that bundle and placed it on Nell's windowsill made a choice. It did not place a random collection of forest material. It placed specific plants in a specific combination appropriate to a specific situation. That choice required knowledge of the plants, knowledge of their properties and their cultural meanings, knowledge of the situation on the other side of the window glass, and knowledge of how to communicate that knowledge across the gap. I've thought about where that knowledge comes from. The most straightforward possibility is that it's inherited, passed down through generations, on the upper ridge the way the rules are passed down through generations of human families on the lower slopes. If these beings have been on that ridge for thousands of years alongside Cherokee communities that understood and used these plants, the knowledge of what they are and what they do would have accumulated on the ridge side of the arrangement, the same way the rules accumulated on the human side. Each generation learns from the previous one. I want to tell you about one more person I talked to. I'll call her Agnes. She is in her 80s, one of the oldest residents of the Kello community, which is a small intentional community on the South Toe River that was established in the 1930s and has been there ever since. Agnes grew up in these mountains, not in the Kello community, but in the broader area, and came back to the region in her 30s after years away. She has lived on the South Toe for 50 years. She told me something that placed the encounter Nell had into a longer frame than I'd been working with. She said she had heard of this kind of thing before. Not recently, years ago, decades ago. From older people in the community who had in turn heard it from their parents. She said the account she had heard was of a woman on a property several miles up the watershed from where Nell lives, sometime in the first decades of the 20th century, who had seen something similar. A woman living alone on a mountain farm while her husband worked in the lumber industry. This was the period when commercial logging was opening up the higher elevations of the Black Mountains and the surrounding ranges, a brutal period for the forest that left large sections of the upper ridges stripped of their old growth. The logging disrupted a lot of things that had been stable. The woman had seen something at her window on a night in August. The account Agnes had heard was second-hand, maybe third-hand, fragmentary. The woman had told someone who had told someone, and Agnes had received it through that chain. But the shape of it was consistent. Something large and dark-haired and upright had come to the window of the farmhouse on the upper slope, and it had been holding something young, and it had waited for the woman to look at it, and the woman had looked. Agnes said she thought the logging had disrupted the upper drainages enough that the beings who used them had come lower than they ordinarily would have. The upper terrain they relied on was being cut, and they moved down the slope, and one of them came to the nearest house and did what they did when they needed to be acknowledged. I asked her what she made of the fact that both encounters had the same shape, the coming to the window, the young one being held up to be seen. She said she thought it was the same gesture. The same gesture that had been used for a long time, across multiple generations, whenever the relationship needed something. A presentation, an acknowledgement, a request to be seen and to be witnessed. She said, think about what it would mean to need something from people on the lower slope and not share a language with them. You can't explain. You can't tell someone what you need or why. You can show them. You can show them what you have, what is new and vulnerable, and you can show them enough that they understand the situation. And if they are people who have been good neighbors for long enough, that you trust them to understand, you come to their window and you show them. And the expectation, the ancient accumulated expectation, is that they will look and nod, because that is what good neighbors do. Agnes said she didn't know whether what Nell had experienced and what the woman in the early 20th century had experienced were encounters with the same family of beings, or different ones, or whether family was even the right word for the social unit. She said she thought the word that fit best was community. There was a community on the upper ridge that had been there for a very long time, and there were human communities on the lower slope that had been there for a shorter, but still substantial time. And the two communities had worked out, over that span of time, the terms of their coexistence. Agnes told me something else that I want to share, because she said it with such clarity that it has stayed with me. She said, the question people always want to ask is, what are they? They want a classification. They want a slot to put it in: primate, undiscovered species, supernatural entity, something from folklore. And I understand why they want that. But I think the more important question, the one that actually matters for how you live on this land, is what is the relationship? Not what are they, but what is the relationship between them and us on this piece of ground? And how do we sustain it? And what does it require of us? Nell's family knows how to sustain it. They may not know all the history behind the rules they follow, but they follow the rules, and the rules work, and the relationship holds. Nell was one of those people. Her family has been one of those families for at least 3 generations, maybe more. The relationship is old enough that the young one on the ridge will grow up knowing the lower slope the way Nell grew up knowing the upper ridge, as something to be respected, to be engaged with through careful behavior. And someday, if the pattern holds, the young one will stand at Nell's fence or at the fence of whoever lives in that house after Nell and Roy, and there may be something it needs to show. And the people in the house will have the rules, and they will know to look. I want to close with something Nell said the last time I was there. It was a small thing, said in passing, as I was getting ready to leave and we were standing on the porch with our coffee, looking at the slope behind the garden. She said, "You know what gets me? She's a mother. Whatever else you want to say about her, whatever you want to call her, or think she is, or put her in some category, she came down off that ridge with a new baby, and she wanted someone to see it. That's a mother thing. That's what mothers do." She looked up at the tree line. She said, "I hope the baby's doing well." I stood there with her for a minute. The sky was doing what the sky does in these mountains when the weather is good. That deep blue you only get at elevation, with the hardwoods leafing out below it and the dark hemlocks above them and the ridgeline against all of it. The slope was alive with the sounds of spring. Warblers in the canopy, a wood thrush starting up somewhere in the hemlock section, the creek audible somewhere below the house. Up above the hemlock section, above the second bench, somewhere in the pitch pine and the mountain laurel and the wind off the ridge, something was up there, had always been up there, was raising a young one up there right now, teaching it whatever it teaches them, the territory, the roots, the seeps and the food sources and the human farm on the lower slope, and what those people are like, and how to approach them if you need to, and how to leave them alone when you don't. Nell finished her coffee. She said, "All right," and went back inside to check on Roy. The porch was quiet. The slope behind the garden fence went up into the trees. Somewhere up there, 2 sets of tracks are worn into the path along the lower bench. One of them is still growing. That's everything I have. What I'm left with, after more than a year of thinking about it, is this. Something lives in the high country of the Black Mountains that we do not have an accepted category for. It has lived there for a very long time, long enough that the Cherokee people built a full understanding of its presence into their cultural practices and oral tradition, long enough that the European settlers who came after incorporated partial versions of that knowledge into rules they passed down without explaining why, long enough that the landscape itself has been organized in practice around the reality of its presence. What I know is what I've told you. A mother came to a window in the dark mountains of Yancey County, North Carolina, and she held up something new to be seen, and a woman who had lived her whole life in the shadow of that ridge looked at it and nodded. And in the morning there were medicinal plants on the windowsill. That seems like enough. That seems like more than enough. Let me tell you one more thing about the mica piece on the cord. Mica has been mined in these mountains for a very long time, longer than the recorded European presence in the region by thousands of years. There are prehistoric mica mining sites in Yancey and Mitchell counties that were worked by cultures we now call woodland, and earlier, people who understood the properties of mica, its transparency, its ability to split into thin sheets, its reflective quality, and valued it highly enough to extract and trade it across large distances. Mica from the southern Appalachians has been found in archaeological sites throughout the eastern half of North America, at Hopewell sites in Ohio, at mound sites in the Mississippi Valley, at locations that are 1,000 miles from where the mica was quarried. It was a trade commodity of enormous value in the pre-contact world. The piece of mica in the cord Nell found in her garden after the second summer was polished smooth. Not freshly broken from its matrix, not rough and unworked. Smooth in the way that things get smooth from sustained handling, from being held and turned and held again. The edges were worn. This was not a piece of raw mica. This was a piece of mica that had been held for a long time. I keep thinking about that. A piece of mica that had been held for a long time, by something that has been on that ridge for a long time, and that was placed on a fence rail for a woman who had lived her whole life in the shadow of that ridge and who, one night, in late July, had looked at a new baby through a window and nodded. The mica is clear. When you hold it up to light, you can see through it. That transparency is one of the properties that made it valuable in the old trade networks, the old exchange systems that moved it from these mountains across half a continent. Something about the seeing-through quality of it, the way it lets light pass and still holds its form, made it worth carrying 1,000 miles. She held it up to the kitchen window light when she showed it to me. The early spring sun came through it and hit the shelf and the wall below in a faint, scattered shimmer. She said, "I think it's a hello. I don't know what else to call it. I think she's right. I've been back to Yancey County once more since." A Saturday in late September, the leaves just starting to turn. Roy was out checking the woodpile when I pulled up, the knee finally holding, the color back in his face. Nell was inside, and the coffee was on. Before I left, I stood at the east-facing kitchen window and looked out at the garden, mostly done for the season. The marigold row was still standing, gone to seed, the dried heads holding on against the first frosts. The fence post at the garden corner still had its mark. I looked at it for a while in the September light. 2 curved lines and a horizontal mark between them, pressed into the old wood with whatever degree of force it takes to leave a 1/4-inch impression in chestnut. I don't know what it means. I've stopped expecting to know. Garrett came out to look at it, at Nell's request, about a week after she found it. He brought his phone and took photographs of it in the morning light and in the afternoon light, because the angle of light changes how clearly the impression reads in old wood. He measured the depth of it with a feeler gauge he used for engine work. A 1/4 inch, consistent across the impression, which he said meant whatever made it had used sustained, controlled pressure, not a strike or a scrape. A strike leaves a different profile, deeper at the point of contact, shallower at the edges. This impression was even, something had pressed deliberately into the wood and held. He compared it to the galax leaves, looking at them on his phone side by side. The same shape, but the proportions were slightly different. The version on the fence post was larger, the curves wider apart, the horizontal mark longer. He thought about that for a while, then said maybe scale was a factor. Maybe the size of the surface changes the size of the mark. Maybe it was made by a different individual. Nell said she thought it had been made the night of the 3rd encounter, the night of the window, either before or after. Something was at the fence that night that had also been at the fence on the 2nd night, and the mark was a product of that visit. She had found it 2 weeks after the fact, but that didn't mean it was 2 weeks old. Old gray chestnut wood doesn't read impressions the way soft clay does. An impression that deep in dry wood could hold for years without degrading. Garrett said, so it's been watching the house for a long time. He didn't say it as a question. Nell said, I think that's right. I think it's been watching the house since before I was born. He looked at the fence post for a while longer. Then he put his phone away, and they went inside and had coffee. I don't know what it means. I've stopped expecting to know. Don't go above the 2nd bench after dark. The east window is open.